So we're back on the senses. Recently I've been preaching, I don't know really where this came from, but I'll say the Lord for sure. Just some series of messages that have been on senses. And so we talked about the sense of hearing. We talked about, are you listening? We talked about the sense of smell. How do you smell? Last week I talked a little bit about what do you see? And just being able to remember the lenses on, that we can see what God is doing and the way He wants us to see those things. And so it left me this week with one of two things. I could do either touch or taste. And so I settled on taste. And as I was going through this, getting ready for this, I thought about, because I've been asking questions like, are you salty? I thought that would be a good, catchy sermon title, and some of us might like to answer that in the wrong way. Yeah, I'm a little salty. But remember that whole verse that says, if salt loses saltiness, it should be tossed out and trampled. We are the salt of the world. But then I thought about communion, and today was communion. So I thought, what a great application for taste. And as I was thinking about communion, have you ever asked, again, I've done a series or a service or two on why communion? Now, if you were isolated from Christianity completely, and you walked into a room full of people, and they had a table set in front, and people got these little shot glasses full of grape juice and little crackers, would you be like, what are they doing? I mean, it's such a peculiar thing that we do once a month as an ordinance in our church. And sometimes I don't know that we really answered the why question. Like, why did Jesus at the Last Supper choose that moment? If He's revealing what's to come, He had all these times, all these moments with His disciples, and there are times where He tells them, but this is the one time He says, hey, I'm going to give you something that I want you to continue to do. It wasn't when He was in the garden praying. It wasn't like the signs and wonders. It was when He was at this table with His disciples, and they were eating a meal together. He took that meal and He said, hey, I want you to do this in remembrance of me. Biblically, festivals and meals, they kind of follow God's people. It was the way in which God's people did things. And Jesus was gathered with His disciples for the Last Supper, and it was a celebration of one of those Jewish festivals. It was the festival of Passover that they were celebrating. That was the context of the meal. And so then I asked about communion, like, why this? But then the question goes back even further beyond Jesus. Why did God choose to institute meals and festivals to remember what He was doing, the Jewish festivals? And so I just want to read a verse, and this is going to kind of be the verse that everything builds on today. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in Him. Last week we talked about seeing, and tasting is actually the help for us to fully see. You see, this series that I'm doing, this, quote, sensory series that I'm doing, really is biblical. The festivals, the reason behind the meals was that God was instituting ideas in which His people could sense, they could hear, they could see, they could smell, they could feel the things that God was doing. They could taste things that would help them to recall. Now, we have all these devices and all these things in which we can record our history today. Most of the history, when these festivals were established, was transferred or was remembered how? Orally, right? We would tell stories. And you know what? My rememberer isn't the best rememberer. There's a lot of things that I forget. My wife will tell you that. She can watch a movie once and she can tell you what happens in the next scene. I can watch a movie 10 times and not even tell you how it ends. I mean, that's just me. That's just how I work. My rememberer just isn't the best rememberer. And so God knew his creation well enough to know that I had to give them some tools to help them to remember. Gary Hoyt, he was a pastor in Bellevue Christian Center. I remember the first time I met him, and I introduced myself to him, and my wife was with me, and she introduced herself. And so we said, "Hi, I'm Steve, and this is my wife, Tamara." And he began to repeat our names, literally out loud, so he could remember them. But the guy was incredible, like he would never forget your name because he'd come up with a way in which he could remember. Well, so God knows us and knows that sometimes we need some help remembering. So these Passover or these festivals and feasts, he included sights and sounds and tastes. Why? To help us recall them. Today, specifically, we're going to look at the celebration of the Passover. We're going to see the why behind that, because I believe that when Jesus was at this table with his disciples, the tastes and the sights and the smells of this table were taking them to a specific place. We can read the verses and talk about, eating a cracker and drinking a cup of grape juice, but there was so much more to that moment that was being experienced in that element. What happened for the Passover? Well, remember, Israel, they moved down to Egypt because there was famine in the land and they lived in Egypt. While they were there, they prospered and multiplied so much that Pharaoh got a little nervous about the power and authority they had, or they could have. So what did he do? He decided to do? He decided to put them in harsh slavery conditions. Exodus, I think it's chapter 12, verse 40, says that they were in Egypt for a time frame of about 430 years. A significant portion of that time was in bondage and slavery. And at some point, God decided what? It was time to bring his people out of Egypt. So he called someone. Do you remember who he called to lead them? Moses. Moses was at this bush. It was on fire, but it wasn't on fire. It was burning, but it wasn't burning. And the voice of God came to him and said to him, "I'm going to cause you to lead my people out of Egypt." So Moses has this calling, this mantle placed upon him that he didn't feel he was worthy to do. What does he do? He has to go talk to Pharaoh, and he knows Pharaoh won't listen to him, right? So God does what? The plagues. Right? He sends these plagues upon the people of Egypt. The first was he turned water into blood, then there were frogs that came, then gnats and flies, then livestock died, then there were boils that came on people, there were hail and locusts and darkness. All these, and every time Moses would go say, "Hey, what? Pharaoh, can you leave yet?" And every time Pharaoh said, "What? Get back at work." Right? I mean, that's Pastor Steve's version. He tells them no. So what's going to happen? God has one last plague that's going to come. This plague is a plague. Now, the weird thing was, some of these plagues, they affected Israel. Some of them did not. Their livestock did not die. But this particular plague, he said, "I'm going to send the angel of death that's going to come, and the angel of death is going to claim the firstborn in every home," right? And he said, "This is every home throughout Egypt, but I'm going to set my people apart. So what I need you to do, people, is get a lamb, sacrifice that lamb, and do what? Put the blood on the doorpost." Okay, so we all know the story. We've all heard it. We probably acted it out in Sunday school at some point. So they put the blood on their doorpost. But you know what's funny about this story? Is that God didn't stop with instructions just to sacrifice a lamb and to put the blood on the doorpost. I want you to see what he continues to do. Exodus chapter 12, if you want to confirm what I've said, read Exodus probably 10 through 12. Then they are to take some of the blood, put it on the sides, tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. So God is telling them what? I'm going to set you free from slavery. Like tonight's the night. It is coming. You're going to be free from slavery. So now, if we've been in slavery for 200 plus years, and we know that this is the first time in my generation that we're not going to be in slavery, I'm going to be making lots of preparations, right? I'm going to be getting what I need. I'm going to be packing up what I want. And what does God tell the people to do? That night, they're to eat the meat, roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Don't eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roast it over a fire with the head, the legs, and the internal organs. Do not leave any of it until morning. If some of it is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it. With your cloak tucked in your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It's the Lord's Passover. Now, I'm thinking, like, this angel of death is coming. We put the blood on the window. I get the whole, like, tuck my robe in and get ready to run. But why are we eating a meal? Isn't that funny? I mean, or peculiar? Or is it just me? Like, interesting that God's instructions in this moment, He's literally establishing a feast that will be remembered. And He's telling them in this feast, there's going to be a lamb. What are the three things He mentions? You're going to eat the meat and the lamb. You're going to have bitter herbs. And you're going to have bread that's made without leaven. Right? And then, when He continues on, in verse 12, on that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals. And I will bring judgment on the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is the day you are to... God's instructions, even in what the people were doing, He was already establishing the feast or festival that would be remembered for how long? Generations to come, right? This is the day you are to commemorate for generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. I want you to taste and see the goodness of God. I want to establish for you that when you tell the story for generations to come, and we still have this moment. This week I've been consumed with reading about the Seder meal and just looking up what Jews today are celebrating. I recognize there's probably some differences in what Jesus was celebrating at this Passover feast. I downloaded a whole leader's guide so I could read through the outlines, the different pieces of it. But the reality is, God was saying, I want you to establish this festival that's going to last for generations to come. That festival was still lasting when Jesus sent His disciples to town and said, when you get to town, you're going to find a man carrying a jug of water. And he's going to take you to his master's house. Right? And then I want you to do what? Make preparations for the Passover. It's the context in which Jesus spoke. I guess I should continue those verses. For 7 days you eat bread made without yeast. On the first day remove the yeast from your houses. For whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first to the seventh will be cut off from Israel. On the first day hold a sacred assembly, and another on the seventh day. Do no work at all on these days except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. I mean, that sounds like a fun week. Right? What do we get to do all week long? Make food and eat. I mean, it sounds like a good week. Except to prepare food for everyone to eat. But the reality is, and especially today when I was reading, and it's funny how we're people, and I'll tell this story, reading about, because I'm talking about someone, not me, anyway, maybe it's the wrong interpretation, but even today, the preparations include the Jews going through their entire home, and they have to clean everything. Like, extensively clean everything, because their goal is to remove every possibility of yeast, or I think the word was chametz, and I'm not Jewish, so I could say it wrong, like that's like a Kentucky boy trying to talk French. That's what I'm doing right now. Just ignore my words. But what it was is they had to go through the entire house. And it wasn't just this small process. It was this diligent process. And excuse me for being too candid right now, I read an article that said some people had their single grain whiskey in their house. And if they didn't want to, because guess what they had to do with everything that had leaven in it that was unclean? They had to throw it away. They had to get rid of it. So if they said, but they have this process now in which they can put stuff in a closet in their house and lock the closet. And then the rabbi comes, and before Passover, Passover, he buys everything from them and sells everything from them in the closet. And then after Passover, they can buy it all back from the rabbi. I'm assuming at a cost, just because that's the way we do things. Anyway, after the sides of it, but this whole idea of preparations. The disciples, when they went to town, they were told to go and begin to prepare themselves to celebrate the Passover meal. This morning I'm going to say we need to prepare ourselves for the table that we're coming to in Jesus Christ. We can do this and it can be ritual. And I know there's so much in life we do that is commonplace, and we do it so many times. Just like when we sing songs or we pray, we can lose sight of the reality of the God who loves us. That's why Paul, when he writes to the church in Corinth, he says, examine yourselves so you don't eat this meal in an unworthy manner. He was pointing back to the thought process of the Passover meal where we were so diligent. That's a new word. We were so diligent about the thought process of what? Any type of leaven, any morsel of leaven in our entire home. We would go through it and seek it out. Well, what about ourselves? So anyway, now we'll come to the book of Matthew. On the first day of the festival of the unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover? He replied, go into the city and a certain man and tell him, the teacher says, my appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples at your house. So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them and prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. And while they were eating, in the course of what? They were celebrating the feast and festival to remind God's people of the Passover, where the death angel passed over those who had applied the blood of the Lamb to their doorpost. While they were eating, he said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. They were very sad and began to say to him one after another, surely you don't mean me, Lord. Jesus replied, the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl will betray him. It says the Son of Man will go just as it has been written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, surely you don't mean me, Rabbi. Jesus answered, you have said so. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat. This is my body. Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink from the fruit of this vine from now until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. Taste and see. So in those, today we're not doing an entire Passover Seder because I'm definitely not qualified and learned enough to lead that. But what we're going to do, I want to look at three elements that I saw that took place at this meal. I recognize the two that Paul includes in Corinthians, and we're going to get to that. But the first element, sometimes I think we can overlook. Jesus replied, the one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. Now, I was reading some studies, and even myself started to think about this. What was in the bowl that Judas was dipping with Jesus? Any thoughts? Huh? We think salsa or something like that. What? Oil? No. Huh? No, it wasn't a wash basin. The bitter herbs. So part of the celebration of the Passover meal, part of what they would do, that Jesus, or God had instituted, right? We read it back in Exodus chapter 12, was they were to have bitter herbs. What were the bitter herbs symbolic of? What were they to call to mind when someone consumed them? Well, the bitter herbs caused the people to think about their bitterness in Egypt. Their bitterness from the slavery of Egypt. That's why why they were asked to participate in it. And that also became with them the bitterness of the bondage of slavery to sin in their life. How profound is the moment Jesus says, someone at this table is going to betray me. And everyone at the table is saying, not me, not me, not me. And in that moment that Jesus and Judas are dipping their hands in the bitter herb, the one that represents bondage to slavery, Judas, Jesus says it's the one who's got his hand in the bondage of sin. This morning as we participate in our meal, I have bitter herbs, and I'm just going to warn you, I could not get fresh horseradish, because that's what typically they serve at a Jewish Seder, is horseradish. So this is from a bottle, and it is strong. Okay? But again, and I'm not saying this is part of our communion meal, but there is a time and a place where I need to be reminded of the bitterness of my sin. You know, sometimes I think we can lose sight of the bitterness of our lives and what we've been set free from. Sometimes I think we can forget about what sin caused in us and how gross and tough it was for us. And we can forget about what we've been set free from. I mean, we got yummy Welch's grape juice that we get to drink. It tastes good. And today, even when we get to the bread, I made something other than the stale crackers because I felt like we were tasting and seeing. Right? There's something to knowing what I've been set free from. Israel came to the Passover meal and they participated in bitter herbs so they would never forget where they've been set free from. In my life, sometimes I need to remember. I'm not saying we live. I'm not saying go back. Remember, they get out and they start mumbling and complaining, grumbling and complaining that they want to go back to Egypt because there it is, they had food sitting around tables, right? Or the fire. I'm not saying we go back. But I am saying sometimes we need to be reminded of the bitterness of the life we've been set free from. Okay? So there's three elements I said. The second element we'll see. While they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and when he gave thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Again, what was the bread that Jesus picked up? What kind of bread was it? Unleavened. Why was it unleavened? Because there would be no yeast. Why didn't they use yeast in it? Because they were in a hurry. They didn't have time. That was the whole idea behind it. It wasn't he saying yeast is bad. The people had to make bread real fast. And they didn't want it to come from anything that had to do with Egypt. And so they made this bread very quickly. And at this Passover meal, I know contemporary ones, there's 3 pieces of matzah at least that every person has. 3 pieces of unleavened bread that are used in this meal. And one of these particular pieces, and this is Pastor Steve's interpretation, or even what I've read others say, it's the question of like what was taking place in the meal. Because again, if you look at a Passover meal, every element represents something, right? And it can be as simple as reminding us of the unleavened, that we can have no hint of sin in us. But there was also another peculiar piece of that bread. At the beginning of the meal, it said that the leader of the Seder would take a piece of matzah and he would break it in half. And he'd take the bigger half and he would hide it. Now, when I read this Passover celebration, or this meal that Jesus is celebrating, it's interesting because we don't mention what? The lamb. Wouldn't you think the lamb would be talked about, like when they were eating some meat? Jesus would have said, "Hey, this is me." They didn't talk about it then. But he took this piece of bread. Now, that piece of bread was representative of the Passover lamb. That's what it represented. Okay? In its wholeness, it represented the Passover lamb. When it was broken and the larger portion was hidden, that was not for the Passover lamb who came, but that was for the Messiah who was coming. That was going to accomplish completely what this Passover lamb accomplished temporarily. It's called the Afigomen, in the celebration of the Passover meal. So potentially, it seems as though this is taking place at the end of the meal, because we see he broke bread, then he took a cup, and then they sang a song and they laughed. So it's close to the end of the meal. That's the portion in which we would find the dessert bread. And he'd pull out that bread that was symbolic of the Messiah. Isn't that a whole different picture? When Jesus says to them, he takes that piece of bread that was representative of the role that God is accomplishing in his life, the purpose that God has sent him to accomplish. And he says, now look at me. I am the Messiah. I'm the one who has come. Take and eat. Participate with me in receiving, right, who I am. Take and eat. This is my body. I believe Jesus was making a declaration, an assertion. That bread that you eat, now Jews ate this bread for 7 days. I'm sure it's a bread that whenever you have food that when you taste it, it takes you to a certain place. This morning, I'm just going to tell you right now, we made some Cincinnati chili. The Cincinnati chili takes me to a place. And so, just for instructions right now, this is not part of the sermon, but Doreen brought some hot dogs. If you want to make a cody, that involves a hot dog, mustard, onions, Cincinnati chili, and cheese on top. You can omit the mustard and onions and still consider it a cody. You take anything else out, it's not a cody. Or we're making some spaghetti noodles, and you can make a three-way, which includes noodles, Cincinnati chili on top, cheese on top. It's delicious. It's sold in chili bars all over the greater Cincinnati area, and some in Florida for the people who retire down there. But anyway, sometimes flavors take us to a specific place. That taste of the dessert bread, that taste of expectation, that taste of anticipation. Think about how many years we've been consuming this meal, how many thousands of years we've been participating in this moment, looking forward to what? The Passover lamb that is coming to take care fully for what was taken care of temporarily. That taste at the end of the meal. Taste and see. The Lord is good. And the last element I'll talk about is in verse 27, he took a cup. When he given thanks, he gave it to them and said, drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Now, like matzah, wine was a typical occurrence in the Passover meal. You know, I was looking through all these things, and you know, it's funny. Ironic, maybe. These are just all nuggets that came up this week. There were 4 servings of wine, typically in a Passover meal. And I saw advertisements for selling Passover wine. You know what they said? For the first 2, buy the cheap wine. You wait till about the 3rd cup of wine to get the really expensive wine. Anyway, that's just a side note. But in Exodus chapter 6, we see the wine. So each of the cups during this meal were symbolic of a promise that came in Exodus chapter 6. Verses 6 through 7. Therefore I say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. So there's 4 cups that they would drink. The first one was to remind people that God will bring you out. Symbolically, it's a cup of sanctification. So that first wine we drink in the meal, the first time we have wine, is to remind us of sanctification, bringing us out of a life in which we live. And then the next one, he says, is I will free you. So it's a cup of deliverance. That's what's reminded when we partake of that. The third one, I will redeem you, a cup of redemption. And the fourth one, I will take you as my own people. It was a cup of hope and promise. And so now Pastor asks the question, which cup was Jesus offering? Right? I mean, I think that would be wise to know. Which, if I'm supposing This is, again, my interpretation of these moments, and it's pretty consistent with others that I've read about. This isn't just something I make up. It was the afikomen, or the dessert bread. What cup was this? And it was either the third or fourth cup that Jesus offered. Most theologians say this was the third cup. It was the cup in which they would have understood redemption. They say that likely Jesus didn't drink the fourth cup because the fourth cup was synonymous with the marriage relationship that was coming, and he was waiting for that cup until he returns at the end of time. So that's just the theory. We only have those before us, but that's what a lot of people assume. So it was this cup of redemption that Jesus was offering. So he brought this up, and these people understood that they would be redeemed, that God was a redeeming God. And when he offered them that cup, they were what? They were drinking redemption. Taste and see. That flavor, that rich wine that we've been waiting for. That full body, but we had the cheap stuff before, but now we're getting into the good stuff. If that's the way, Jesus didn't do it that way, but that's the way it is. Anyway, that full body taste of redemption is what I want you to know. And Jesus offers them that taste, and he says, taste and see. This morning, you guys, Carrie, you can come up anyway. I want to participate in communion. But I had to talk a lot to hopefully provide a picture of what this is accomplished. I have a table that is set. It's pretty full. There's some bitter herbs, some unleavened bread, and some fruit of the vine. And this morning, I hope that we not only participate, but we experience what God is doing in us. That as we come forward, and you don't have to do this, my encouragement would be take a small piece of bread and dip it in the bitter herbs. Spend a moment and think about what? The life that was embittered by sin. I promise, if you've got a weak tongue like mine, it'll sting a little bit. Don't put a giant Whopper on there because you don't have enough grape juice to deal with it. Okay? If you do, you can just suck on your sin for a while. I'll preach some other time. And then I want you to pause and think about what Jesus instructed us. I want you to stop and take another piece of bread and think about the Messiah who has come. The Messiah who was looking at his disciples and he said, take and eat. I am the one who came to set you free. Your life is free from the angel of death. Your life is free from the power of that angel. He cannot come in. And after you've eaten that bread, take a cup of redemption. The promise of the new covenant in Jesus Christ. The promise that you are redeemed. Sometimes we need to know that we're redeemed. Sometimes, I'll tell you what, this horseradish, it stinks. It smelled up the kitchen this morning when I got it out. Sometimes we feel like we're controlled by sin, and we've never been redeemed. You have been redeemed. You're no longer defined by sin. You're no longer under the authority of sin. You've been set free from that. That's a good taste. And when I come, I know that blood was shed and a body was broken so that I could be his. That no longer could the God of this age, that no longer could the angel of death, that no longer could the enemy have authority over my life because I'm a child of God. That's what the table says. Taste and see that God is is good. Father, this morning, as we come to the table that is set in a context, just like you said in Exodus, we do this for generations to come. Jesus reminded us at the table to do this for generations to come. That we might taste and see, that we might remind ourselves of the redemptive work you've accomplished in us. God, if anyone in this room is still under the authority of sin, if anyone in this room still feels like they're in bondage in Egypt, I pray that today would be a day in which the Passover lamb would be revealed in their lives. How does that happen? We apply His blood to our doorposts. God, if we still feel like we're in Egypt and we need to be set free, that this morning we can say a simple prayer. God, I have once been in bondage to sin, but I want to be set free. The way to be set free is through Jesus Christ. He died, so His blood can be applied to my life. I confess with my mouth that Jesus Christ is the Lord. I believe in my heart that God raised Him from the dead. When we say that prayer, God, we now get to participate in the fullness of this meal. Egypt no longer has authority. Slavery is no more. We've been set free from bitterness. God, as we come to your table today, let us celebrate who you are and what you've done. I'm going to let them sing today. I really don't want you to quote the song. But I want to leave on the screen are the words that I usually read. I'll read them now, but if you want to take a moment, if you need them first, you can, Lord. But I also passed on to you, the Lord Jesus, on the night He was betrayed. What did He do? He took some bread, and when He given thanks, He broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The same way, after supper, He took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes." I want those words to be out there. If you want to read them again, if you don't need to read them because you've heard me say 3 or 4 different times this morning, but you want to focus on the elements, that's fine. And like I said, the table is set. If you want to taste some bitter herbs and be reminded, do that first. It comes first, right? It's not the end of the meal. If you do that, then pause and break off a piece of that dessert bread. The one that means Jesus Christ is Messiah. Grab a cup that means that you're redeemed and participate in His table up here. Amen? The table is open. Taste and see. Do this in remembrance of me. You proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. The Lord bless you and keep you. May He make His face shine upon you, be gracious to you. May He turn His face towards you, grant you His peace, and may you taste and see that the Lord is good. Amen?